In the mental health field, too often, we've made it seem as if it's just in your head. Just in your head.
The landlord can hijack the rent by 20%. That impacts people's mental health.
Can't have a profit-driven mental health care system if we want our people to be connected and healthy.
Hello, this is Dr. Harriet Farad.
And I'm Max Golding.
And we are so pleased today to have a guest, Kristen Ghodsee, who wrote an incredible and very readable book called Why Women Have Better Sex Under Socialism. She's opening all these doors to us, not forgetting that there have been atrocities in the Soviet bloc countries, but showing what sexuality was, which was incredibly revelatory and freeing for me to read. And I wonder if we could start by talking about how sexuality was treated in the Eastern Bloc countries and in the Soviet Union after the revolution of the Soviet Union.
Yeah, well, let me first say thank you so much for having me. And, I want to start, I always have to feel like I have to start by saying, first of all, that the Eastern Bloc countries are, very various. There's a wide variety of difference. The Soviet Union obviously became the first worker state after 1917 and existed until 1991. And the other Eastern Bloc countries, which were not part of the Soviet Union, but were part of the Eastern Bloc, usually, became socialist countries, state socialist countries, what I call them, after 1945, and variously existed until 1989 or 1990, 91, depending on where you are. And there was an incredible amount of variety in the bloc. So you had goulash communism in Hungary, you had the non-aligned movement and self-managing socialism in Yugoslavia, you had much more heavy-handed form of state socialism in the Soviet Union or in places like Bulgaria. Romania was incredibly pro-natalist, outlawing abortion and all contraception after 1966. So the first thing that's really important is that there's a lot of diversity. And when I speak about the former Eastern Bloc countries, I also want to make it clear that I'm not idealizing them. There are obviously lots of atrocities, and I'm not in any way belittling the reality of certainly things like Stalin's purges and the famines and, various crimes of communism that were committed during the 20th century. But I do think it's important to not allow a Cold War lens to cloud our understanding of a really interesting history around not only, women's issues, but also around issues of sexuality. And I think that countries like Czechoslovakia and particularly Eastern Germany, as well as Catholic Poland, interestingly, and Yugoslavia, and then to a lesser extent, other countries in the bloc like Hungary and Bulgaria, and lastly, places like Romania and the Soviet Union under Stalin between 36 and 55 specifically, and Albania was very retrograde in many respects. But they didn't treat sexuality as merely a question of stimulation, of the right kind of stimulation. So in the West, we have this 4-stage sexual response theory, and that has lent itself to a particular kind of medicalization of sexuality or pharmaceuticalization of sexuality. And I think in the Eastern Bloc, they had a much more holistic idea of people's sexuality. And they really understood that if people are frustrated, exhausted, depressed, ground down by kind of the constant hustle and bustle of life, that it's very difficult to have sort of healthy relationships with your intimate partners, as well as relationships with your friends and your family and your colleagues and so on and so forth. So there's a colleague of mine, for instance, Agnieszka Kozianska in Poland, and she's written a really wonderful book, which has just come out in English just last month, about sexology in Poland and expert knowledge around sexology. And what she shows, I think, is that the Poles were really far ahead of the Americans in understanding sexology as a much more holistic discipline. So that if you wanted to train to become a sexologist, you weren't only studying either medicine or psychology, but you also had to have some background in sociology and philosophy, and particularly in Poland, theology was really important. And so they looked at people as kind of whole beings. And they understood that as whole beings, because they were, of course, their ideology was infused with Marxism, which had a particular idea of individuals not as atomized beings independent of the superstructure of the economic and political system, but as people who are connected to each other in a society where social relations are very much determined by the political and economic structures within which you live. And I think that's something that we could really learn a lot from in this country, to really think about our intimate relations, our personal relations, and even more broadly, our mental health as not only being something that's completely, an individual process or an individual experience, but something that is much more widely connected to the world that we're living in. And, now more than ever during this pandemic, I think that's so important to understand that it's not just you. It's not just in your head, as your podcast is called, right? There's so much more going on in the world that impacts us, and that to try to just treat the individual or, self-analyze, like, why am I reacting in this particular way, undermines this much more expansive view of mental health and social health that I think these state socialist countries in the 20th century, for all of their many deficits, and again, as I said, I'm not ignoring those, they were really onto something in terms of understanding, having a much more expansive understanding of human psychology as a social phenomenon rather than just an individual one.
Wow. And that is amazing to me, because our society is so steeped in sexual shame and sexual innuendo and sexual aspects of selling everything. And it's very, since female sex is supposed to be inhibited, it's commodified and bought. And I wonder, how did they escape that kind of legacy? Did they have it in the first place? What did they do to get people to see that they're people relating and sexuality is part of it?
Yeah, so I think that these socialist countries were really lucky to a certain extent, because they had these really interesting primary texts, some of the kind of heroes of socialist theory, so to speak. So obviously somebody like Friedrich Engels in The Origin of the Family, Private Property and the State. But also, more importantly, the 1878 book by a guy called August Bebel, who was one of the fathers of the German Social Democratic Party. It's called Woman in Socialism. And then later works by the Russian Alexandra Kollontai, who was the first commissar of social welfare in the Soviet Union and a socialist theorist in her own right. All of them talked about how the family, how our intimate relationships, and particularly women, and of course, given that we're talking about largely 19th century thinkers, when I use the word women, I am in fact talking about cisgendered women, because that's who they would have been talking about in the 19th century. They really were thinking very clearly about how capitalism as an economic system very specifically impacts women's sexuality. And they understood that as women's sexuality became a commodity under capitalism, which they very much saw, that it sort of degraded human relationships, heterosexual human relationships between largely men and women. And that as society became more socialistic, or as society became, less about the hustle, so to speak, or less about supply and demand, as women had other opportunities outside the home rather than marriage to actually make a living for themselves, then they would become more independent, and they would be able to choose their partners on the basis of love and attraction and mutual affection, rather than on, this question of whether or not they could find a husband who could support them. So my daughter made me watch this Netflix series that is all the rage right now, Bridgerton, which is, this really, it's this sort of romance story of, aristocrats in England, and it's all about marriage, right? And finding a good match and the whole kind of commodification of that process, and how difficult it is for women to kind of forge their own path, right? Because they have to make a match. They don't really have other options in life. And so people like Engels and Bebel and Kollontai, and also Clara Zetkin, who was also a German theorist, they had a theory. And because Kollontai, they had this theory about, well, if we started to socialize some of the domestic work, and if we actually allowed women opportunities to find employment outside of the home, then they would be able to kind of come into their own in terms of, their sexuality, their relationships with other people. They wouldn't just be sort of sub objects. They would gain subjectivity. And I think that Kollontai, when she became the Commissar of Social Welfare in 1917, she actually tried to act on a lot of those theories and put them into practice. And those policies in the Soviet Union were really progressive until 1936, when they were all reversed largely by Stalin. But interestingly, after the Second World War, they come back in Eastern Europe. And so I think that it's a combination of having really good kind of theoretical insights into the relationship between the political economy and the personal, and the fact that one of these very theorists, this woman, Alexandra Kollontai, actually becomes the Commissar of Social Welfare and is empowered by Lenin and the other Bolsheviks to actually make changes and to see what will happen in society when, markets are removed and love and sexuality are no longer commodities to be bought and sold with prices determined by the vicissitudes of supply and demand.
Yeah, well, that's quite dramatic. I also was truly enlightened reading your book to find out how progressive they were about homosexuality, and how far ahead of us they were.
Not the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union actually wasn't that progressive. In the very early period, it was.
Yes.
So I have a colleague, Dan Healy, who has written wonderful articles about the early Soviet policies where they did decriminalize homosexuality. This was really early in the 1920s. They were very open-minded. But, then again, under Stalin, there's a huge return to social conservatism for a wide variety of reasons. But certainly in places like Czechoslovakia, again, it's surprisingly in Catholic Poland, and probably most notably in the German Democratic Republic, what used to be called East Germany, they were far ahead, I think, of the West in terms of decriminalizing homosexuality and allowing and understanding that this was just a sort of a normal part of human sexuality that should not in any way be criminalized. Now, the Soviet Union was not that great about that particular aspect, but some of these East European countries really were. And I have a colleague as well who writes about same-sex relationships in Hungary. And she also says that for the most part, the Hungarian state didn't really care about people's relationships. They understood that those were things in the private sphere, and they kind of let people do what they wanted. And based on her research, she shows pretty clearly that both, same-sex and opposite-sex couples were pretty happy. They found ways to negotiate around the state. And I think that's also something that we are not aware of in the West.
Right.
And part of that, has to do with socialist theory. August Bebel, this guy who wrote Woman in Socialism, he was a member of the German parliament, and he, I believe, is the first politician ever to stand up on the floor of a House of Parliament, in the Bundestag in this case, and actually argue for the decriminalization of homosexuality. So not only was he really progressive on women's rights, but he really thought that this was a stupid law that should be removed. And it helped a lot, again, that these Eastern Bloc countries were also fairly atheistic, at least officially. Even in Poland, they were officially kind of a sort of form of state atheism, which also allows a much broader acceptance of same-sex relationships, precisely because you don't have this language around, sin that you have in Western countries.
No, it's really important, and it's important to see, as you do so beautifully, you show us beautifully in your book, Why Women Have Better Sex Under Socialism. You show that sexual liberation and connection as part of human connection was taught and celebrated, but then it makes me wonder, what function does shame and commodification have in our system and in religious societies?
Yeah, I think that's a really, that's a pretty profound question. And it's something I think a lot about. And I think that my colleagues in Eastern Europe and I talk about this a lot, the hyper commodification of women's bodies. So if you grew up in Eastern Europe, you just didn't see that kind of advertising, where you have a woman in bikini clad women in Italy selling Pirelli tires or whatever, where women's bodies become like, something that you can sort of put in a picture next to any product. And then, the implicit message to consumers is, if you buy this product, you will either look like this woman or you will be able to have sex like this woman, with this woman. And so I do think that there's this double-edged problem in Western societies, which is there is a lot of shame around sexuality. I haven't seen it yet, but I know that right now there's this big discussion about this documentary Framing Britney Spears that came out last week by the New York Times. And it really talks a lot about her sexuality and the obsession that the American press had with whether or not she was a virgin. And there's so much what we call, colloquially, quote unquote, slut shaming around young girls and women. And at the same time, we live in a society, if you watch music videos or you spend any time looking at advertising, it's so hypersexualized. Young women's bodies are constantly being commodified in this way in order to move product. And I think that really makes I think it's very difficult for young people to negotiate. And then let's not even get started with like Pornhub and things like that. I do think that Eastern Bloc countries had a much more, I don't know if healthy is the right word, but maybe enlightened view where they really did try to decommodify sexuality and actually thought of it as just sort of a natural part of the human experience. And that, especially in Eastern Germany, there's a wonderful book by my colleague called, her name is Josie McClellan, and the book is called Love in the Time of Communism. And it looks specifically at sexuality in Eastern Germany. And what she shows in that book is that the East German government actually thought of good sex as one of the benefits of socialism. They couldn't they wouldn't let you travel, and you didn't have as many fancy, pretty things as they had in the West. But one thing that they really felt that they could brag about was our people have really good sex. And that became almost an official state discourse. So that when you have these studies showing that East German women, were happier in bed or whatever, the East German government really felt like they could take ownership over that. And one of the fun things about having this book be translated into other languages is that it was translated into German. And that book came out in the fall of 2020. And I got emailed by so many East German women and some East German men who were so grateful to me, not because they didn't know what I said from their own experience, that they weren't aware of it, but they were thankful that an American said it because nobody listened to them when they said it, which I thought was really kind of interesting. So it was their own personal experience that had been devalued by, kind of Cold War triumphalism around, no, everything is better in the West. There was nothing good in the East. Everything
Right.
in the East was gray and awful and totalitarian and authoritarian. And it was the Stasi. And so I think that one of the things that we really need to do, as I said earlier, is just really kind of think about how we know what we know about these 20th century state socialist countries. And given that there is so much scholarship out there about everyday lived experience, not only about sexuality, but also just about interpersonal relationships more broadly, and how when we ask people after 1989, what do they miss about socialism? And many of these people actually say, when we do surveys, that their lives were better before 89 or 91. And I think that's something really interesting. But one of the things that they point to is that relationships between people were more authentic, that people supported each other, that people had a lot higher levels of social solidarity. There was a kind of unique form of socialist sociality that people enjoyed that had to do with the fact that not everybody was constantly running around worrying about money and worrying about unemployment and worrying about their kids and worrying about all these other things. And they could also kind of all hate the state together, since the state was their common enemy. So again, I don't want to idealize it. And I certainly am fully aware that there were lots of negative sides, but I do think that at least the ethnographic literature and the public survey data that we have points really clearly to the fact that there's a very high level of nostalgia for the communist era in Eastern Europe, which is weird if it doesn't make any sense if we only think of this past as just being like bleak, gray, totalitarian hellscape that ends in the gulag.
Right. If it's just famines and secret police and everything. I had a quick question for you. So one phrase that stood out from your book to me was, I had it written down. It's in the other room. It was something like the free market discriminates against women, or something like that. And that, I thought that was a really powerful phrase. And going back to a couple of things you said earlier regarding kind of commodification of sexuality, of women's bodies and so on, I was thinking of one study I came across years ago, which was that sort of before and after American and Western advertising was sort of just streamed into the lives of people in South America, that eating disorders amongst young women went to hundreds of percent, went from almost non-existent to super high. And then you start to see all these other the body image issues, as well as we get what we do call, from a more individualistic clinical perspective, quote unquote, I'm putting air quotes here, mental health symptoms, right? That you can actually attribute to sociologically observable factors, right? But we, in the mental health field, we're well, what are your thoughts and feelings or whatever, and how do we treat that? I'm wondering if, based off of your research, and it seems like this is tricky because if the conceptualization of mental health was more holistic, I guess, than how we conceptualize it today, are there studies around things like that for young women and girls, around things like whether it's eating disorders, body image issues, depression, anxiety, just sort of self-confidence, self-esteem issues that we see as sort of an epidemic for young girls in the West?
Yeah. That's I don't actually have any data on things like eating disorders. Now, again, you have to remember that certain types of issues, especially if they were considered very personal, were not really discussed publicly in the East. And I think you're right. There was less of this sort of individual idea of quote unquote, mental health or whatever, or the individual pathologization of girls, right? So to the extent that, I think people had personal, let's just call them issues or problems, right? The idea was that there was always something in the society, more broadly speaking, that was causing it. It wasn't necessarily an individual thing, because all individuals are embedded in a society. So I think that in some ways that's a very supportive, place to kind of grow up in when you're a girl.
Yeah.
Actually, for anybody, right? Because if you're a teenager, let's say, or a young adult, or a middle-aged woman, let's just, speak broadly, anybody, and you're struggling with maybe body image, or you're struggling with burnout or anxiety or depression or whatever. Mm-hmm. You live in a society where that is not all on you. Like right. the discussion of these issues is always in the frame of the larger political economy. Mm. Now, that could be alienating to some people. I don't know. I mean, again, I think that it's a really interesting question, and it would be really useful to go and do and talk to people who actually, treated, who worked in psychology or psychiatry in these countries. Again, the research that I'm most familiar with is around sexual dysfunction and sexology. Mm-hmm. But I also think that one way we can talk about self-esteem and gender roles is when we look at the percentage of, even to this day, the percentage of girls from the former Eastern Bloc countries that go into subjects like math and science, where they don't go into that in the West. And I can give you a very personal example, because my daughter, who is a first-year student at university now, and chemistry was her absolute favorite subject in high school. And she was really, really good at chemistry. And part of this had to do with the fact that when she was in middle school, she did 2 years of middle school in Germany. And one of those years was in Eastern Germany, where there were quite a lot of girls who were interested in science. And before she went off to university, there was a kind of club, where students newly admitted to her university got together. And of course, this was online because it was last summer, and talked about, declaring majors at Princeton, or wherever. And so there was a breakout room for girls interested in STEM. And she was in this breakout room, again, really excited about doing chemistry. And there was a student who was a senior. And the student, so there were 8 or 9 girls or something in this breakout room. And the student who was a senior basically said, chemistry is sexist. If you're going to do chemistry, be prepared to deal with sexism. Don't form study groups with boys, only form study groups with girls. Understand that you will be one of a handful of girls in your labs. Basically kind of read these girls. These are right out of high school, read them the riot act about how difficult it is going to be to go into chemistry in the United States. And not surprisingly, within a day or two, my daughter, who is really, was passionate about chemistry, suddenly started seriously second guessing her decision to study chemistry. And I think that's just crushing, And so we have this acceptance of sexism in this country. Now, and again, I struggle with this myself, because I don't want to say sexism doesn't exist, ignore it. But on the other hand, acknowledging the sexism and just saying, well, you're going to have to work around it if you want to do this. It is so disheartening for young people, especially young girls, I think, young girls and women. And so I do think that the Eastern Bloc countries just didn't have that. It was perfectly acceptable for a young woman to want to be a chemist if that's what she wanted to do. And, again, I don't know how to fix that. I mean, this is the bigger question about how do we deal with these larger issues in our own society? How do we deal with the fact that there is, for instance, systemic sexism and systemic racism and systemic forms of discrimination? Is it better to tell young people to not tell them and have them just ignore it and then suffer the consequences? Yeah. Or do we warn them about it ahead of time and thereby reinforce it and dissuade them from pursuing careers that they might otherwise be interested in pursuing because they don't want to deal with the negative effects of that systemic discrimination? I just don't know.
I think it relates to the previous question about eating disorders, because if mental health is connection, and people feel connected to all other people who are the citizens of their country. That does cut down on the bifurcation of gender. Also, since those societies supported single mothers, the idea that if you are without a man, you're somehow condemned to poverty. One of the first indicators of poverty in the United States is single motherhood. And so that you are condemned for your sexuality and that you bear children. And a disease like anorexia, which I've written about and studied, is about being fed up and hungry, being fed up with being the providers of the first food, the breastfeeders, the bottle feeders, the baby feeders, and the meal makers and the cleaner uppers. That food becomes a compass home to a mother you don't want to leave to go into a hostile society, but who you need to leave into a hostile and sexist society. And so that it has a lot to do with the kind of divisions between people based on their sexuality, whether it's their maleness versus femaleness, or male and femaleness versus non-cisgender relationships. But there is a lack of connection. I think if you emphasize connection as the basis of mental health and try to foster it every way you can, you do circumvent that, and circumvent throwing half of the population out of whatever area you're in. And
Well, sorry.
I was going to say, look, I'm not an expert on eating disorders, but or disordered eating, or, whatever the term is. But I did read an article I think it was just this morning or yesterday morning in The Guardian about the rising number of cases of anorexia and bulimia in the UK. And one of the things that the article said is that these are conditions that often result from people feeling out of control of their life.
Yes.
And given the situation of the pandemic and the lockdown and all of the stresses of that, particularly on women who are doing a lot more care work and are often trying to balance family and work at home, being able to control your eating in this very extreme way is at least a form of control, right, over your life.
Right.
And I do think that in societies with wider social safety nets, now this doesn't only apply to Eastern European countries. It would be interesting to look at Scandinavia, where you have much more social and economic stability and connection. You're going to just naturally feel a lot more in control. And so therefore, you don't necessarily need to displace that control onto controlling your own eating. Now, that's just a thought, but I do think that having connection and support and having a society that doesn't only emphasize hyper individualistic society, that doesn't attribute everything that's wrong with you to you. Right. I teach 18 to 22-year-olds, and I've been doing this for about 23, 24 years now. And one of the things that I feel that is so difficult with my students is that everything that happens to them, they attribute to something that they failed to do, or that they didn't work hard enough to achieve, even if it's like the pandemic took away their internship or their job or whatever. And we have to get away, I think, from attributing everything that happens in the world to ourselves. There's a lot of randomness and a lot of injustice boiled into our economic system, especially in terms of these systemic forms of discrimination. And we have to be willing to place the blame outside of ourselves. And I think we live in a culture that, for one reason or the other, really wants to individualize everything.
Well,
even
they don't want
negative.
us to criticize. They don't want us to look at the social forces,
Yes.
because then we'd make the demand to have some social support. And as somebody who did study eating disorders, young women who are particularly afflicted are defined as bodies in the West. So whatever drama you take out, you take it out on your body as you have been defined as a body.
Mm.
And one of the things that happens is girls are torn. They're usually ambitious girls who have eating disorders like anorexia or bulimia, is that you are torn between wanting to cling to a mother-child relationship outside of a capitalist network to having to make it in a capitalist society and suppress that in yourself. And food is a compass home, and it's a compass to mothering. And it's very hard for young women who have to choose, in a sense, identities and who are defined as bodies. And I don't think that was so from your book. I don't think that was so in the Eastern Bloc countries that you write about. And I know that it isn't as the same way in the Netherlands now or Scandinavia, where there's a lot more of a social support network for women. And those are countries that also have better sexuality and greater happiness personally, greater sense of well-being, and more liberation for women. Because all of these forces come out on women's bodies because women are defined as the body politic. Men are the head.
I have a sort of thought question on that too. It actually goes all the way back to your comments, Kristen, on STEM, and your own daughter, and then back to sort of bodies and identity. And I guess because a lot of the conversations that we have now about like liberal, identity politics, I guess as it's called, and there's, not to get into like sticky stuff on that, but like, I actually just pulled up your book real quick and was looking at the picture of I don't know if I'm saying it right.
Valentina Tereshkova. Yeah.
Thank you for saying it properly. And I'm just actually going to read the excerpt so people can't see this, but she was the first woman in space. She orbited the Earth 48 times in 1963. And then after her career as a cosmonaut, she became a prominent politician, led the Soviet delegation to the UN in 1975. And so I'm sitting here listening, sort of zooming out of our conversation. I'm thinking like, okay, so way before like lean in feminism and like, you go girl and speak up and all that sort of discourse emerged in the West, we had the first, woman in space. I mean, during a time when, again, it's just like, it's all just gulags and famines and stuff, right? And I'm like wondering with her, Valentina, how do you say her name?
Valentina. Yeah.
Valentina, I'm wondering, okay, like, how did she see herself, right? Did she see herself as like, I'm a strong woman representing women? Like in terms of like the conceptualization within these countries and these societies, right? Like, because this seems like there must be a pretty stark difference. I mean, maybe she did, and I don't know, but like, did she see herself more as part of a collective, as a Soviet, as like as part of a class, as part of a unified group, or was she like as an individual woman? I'm stepping into outer space, and I am, I'm going to be so young women can see me, right? And like, because not that would be wrong, and like that maybe that was present, but almost in an ironic way, if she was actually coming at it from a totally different angle, did it actually get maybe better results for women? And I don't know if I'm making sense in that question.
I know exactly what you're saying, actually. Yeah. And this is something, it's something I'm actually writing about right now. So in addition to Valentina Tereshkova, there's a woman called Ludmila Pavlichenko, who was she was a sniper in the Soviet army during World War II. She had 309 confirmed Nazi kills. She's this incredible woman. And she came to the United States in 1942 in order to help the Roosevelts kind of whip up support for the American entrance into the war. And she toured the country with Eleanor Roosevelt. And one of the things that I've done is read a whole bunch of newspaper articles from 1942 describing this woman as this cold-blooded, because, you're a sniper, you're looking through a sight and you're killing people in cold blood. Mm-hmm. And she was also very feminine. And she would wear this Red Army uniform, and they would ask her stupid questions about like whether she wore silk underwear, whether she powdered her nose. I'm not kidding you.
Wow.
And she's like, and at one point they told her that her uniform made her look fat. And she responded by saying, I am a soldier. I have the blood of my comrades on this uniform, right? You gentlemen have been hiding behind my skirt for too long. I'm out there fighting and you're here asking me these stupid questions, right?
Yeah.
So, I mean, she shut them down. She was a sensation in the United States. Some billionaire widower asked her to marry him. I mean, people I think Arlo Guthrie or somebody wrote a song about her, and she was asked to do an advertising campaign for cigarettes. I mean, she was just this. And the thing that was so interesting, right, is that what Americans have a really hard time with is understanding that your question is about what role did these women play? How did they think of themselves?
Yeah,
and in both cases, a cosmonaut and a sniper, right? Very masculine roles. And yet they were very feminine and they were very conscious about their role as women. And they wanted to be seen as feminine, and they wanted to be seen as women. And they also, by the way, wanted to be seen as mothers. And so in her own career as a politician, Tereshkova, the first woman in space, she would often present her kind of key issue was peace. And she would go out on the international stage and say, if there were more women in positions of power, we would live in a more peaceful world, because women are mothers. They don't want to send people off to die. They want to take care of everyone. And so there was a very essentialized notion of what it meant to be, in this case, a cisgendered woman in the Soviet Union. And so the Soviets did this weird thing whereby they put women in all of these very masculine professions, tractor drivers, pilots, right? Cosmonauts, snipers. And they promoted the idea that women are the absolute equals of men in society, and that society has a responsibility to make sure that women can combine their work and family. But at the same time, and I think this is where Westerners and Americans in particular have a really hard time understanding what was going on in the Soviet Union and these Eastern Bloc countries, is that they didn't challenge traditional gender roles.
Right.
They didn't challenge patriarchy. They still thought of women as mothers, as women, and they still went out of their way to kind of present women as feminine in a really what we would think of as stereotypically feminine way, right? And part of that was a response to American anti-Soviet propaganda in the 40s and 50s, which made Soviet women look ugly and fat and defeminized, right? Masculine. There are a couple of articles that I can point to where you can see the way that Soviet women were portrayed by the US as a way of essentially discouraging American women from pursuing equal rights. So when women in the US, wanted to say, look at the Soviet Union, they have all these equal rights for women. They've put a woman in space. The propaganda was, but if you do that, you'll be ugly.
Right.
You'll be fat and you won't have makeup and you won't have nice clothes. And, the Soviets had a woman at the United Nations, for instance, in the 50s. And all of the press reports around her was that she wore a very simple black dress. She had a short haircut and she didn't wear makeup. And everybody thought that was awful, right? This was during the time of Dior's new look. And, she just stood out as this sort of imposing Soviet woman. So I think your question is a really interesting one because it gets to the heart of they did this thing differently, which is they didn't challenge gender roles. They allowed men to be men and they allowed women to, embrace this sort of social construction of femininity as it was constructed in the Soviet Union. And yet at the same time, they absolutely insisted on the equality of the sexes, and they put all of these resources into making sure that women excelled in their professions and that didn't face any discrimination if they wanted to enter these traditional male professions. And so the best example of this, I think, is both at the Olympics and in chess, right? So the Soviet women in the Olympics, just wiped the floor in terms of gold medal counts because they were such good athletes. And international women's chess was also dominated by the Soviets. And again, I think it's really, this is, if you've watched The Queen's Gambit, I think this is also an interesting thing, right?
I enjoyed that a lot.
They were saying that like women can be women and they can excel as women. We don't have to do away with traditional gender roles in order to give women equality. Now, as you said, there's this third rail of identity politics. And I know that a lot of people out there are going to find it very problematic to not want to challenge gender roles. But I do think what the Soviet example and the Eastern Bloc example shows us to a certain extent is that you can achieve a certain amount of equity in society, and you can certainly expand the social safety net so wide so that single mothers and women with children who are also working do not have to struggle to make ends meet. And that can happen, and it can happen really successfully even while you kind of maintain a sort of retrograde or traditional view of male and female roles in society. And that, I think, is really hard for a lot of Americans to understand.
It is. You can see that with a lot of the Congress and senators hating Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, combines brilliance and political accomplishment with beauty.
Exactly.
In a way they can't handle. They're more comfortable with Elizabeth Warren, who is studiously, physically plain.
Yes.
They can see her as a political associate. But Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez enrages them.
Oh yeah, absolutely. But also she's younger and she's part of like the squad, so to speak, right? So this idea of being part of a collective, of having support. I do think, Tereshkova, when she was as a politician after she returned from space, she presented herself as sort of, and you often heard this language, a daughter of the Soviet Union. Yes. That's how she was portrayed. As a daughter. And she was, in fact, also a mother, right, herself. And she was often shown with her children, and she often had flowers for International Women's Day, right?
Yeah.
But she really went out on the international stage when she led the Soviet delegation, for instance, to the First World Conference on Women in Mexico City in 1975. She came as a representative of what the Soviets thought the future of women's emancipation looked like. And it was very, very different than what American feminists like Betty Friedan, who was also in Mexico City, were imagining. And so from the very beginning, there was this incredible tension between what it meant to achieve gender equality. Did gender equality mean that men and women needed to be the same?
Right.
Or did it mean that gender equality, in this other conception, did it mean that men and women could maintain differences, right? Or even that there could be a plethora of gender identities, right? It doesn't necessarily have to be the binary, but that all gender identities are allowed, but none of them should be associated with a diminished position in society.
That's so important. There's a film called Potiche, which in French means trophy wife, in which Catherine Deneuve is so inspired and so feminine that her followers, who are hugely successful, chant "Mommy, Mommy" as their affirmation of her. And what it's doing is showing that you can embody femininity with its questioning of oneself, with its nurturance, and yet have incredible power. And I think that is an enormously important thing that women had, the ability to have personal and political and social power as they express themselves either through often stereotyped ways, but as they felt fulfilled on every level. And that's very inspiring to those of us who live in societies that diminish women in order to make us attractive.
Well, Kristen, your theme too, the what's the phrase, the sort of subtitle of
Economic independence. Yeah.
right. So because that really stood out to me as like it's fascinating because again, if we're going to talk about like women's liberation, like talking about women's liberation and economic independence, like don't always seem intuitively like they'd go hand in hand necessarily. And the idea of, I mean, I guess it depends on who you talk to, but the idea of economic independence I could see is actually sounding almost like a kind of capitalist, like, you know, economic independence. But like throughout the book, you point out a lot of statistics on just like how bad women have it in the West and in the US more than say like Nordic countries or whatever. But that due to women's sort of subservient independent status, still in a lot of ways, still a lot more than I think we realize, like on men, you know, for economic reasons, that this actually like really diminishes women's quality of life in a variety of ways. And like before we started recording, mentioning like the single mom stuff, that's like really sad that like capitalism doesn't like single moms very much. But I guess I wonder like, because part of that whole thing, instead of going at things from a quote unquote identity perspective first, like let's atomize all these different separate identities and be like, okay, how do we advance the identities after we've like parsed them all out as like the 1,000 sub iterations of them or whatever, and then like fight for the identities. That if you start from, and again, it obviously flaws throughout this part of the world in many ways, but if you start from the economic equality sort of perspective, right, that we just have sort of the economic basic needs met and we're all sort of slotted into roles as laborers, that like, I mean, I guess you kind of covered it, but like, does that actually just achieve the goal better than separating out identities and then going from that?
Of course it does. I mean, because think about it, you know, what is the purpose of separating out the identities? Often there's a kind of competitive victimhood that's going on, which ultimately expresses itself into a kind of, you know, it's about capitalism's ability to kind of divide us along these particular axes in order to let us scramble amongst ourselves for what are scarce resources, because we have an elite class, the 1%, as it's called, that is hoarding massive amounts of resources, right? So if you think about it, if you gave everybody a floor, right? And this could be, I mean, again, we could get into the details, whether you're talking about some kind of collective ownership of industry, or whether we're talking about taxation and redistribution through UBI or sovereign wealth funds. There are all sorts of ideas out there floating in the ether. But let's just imagine a world in which everybody had kind of housing, healthcare, education, heat, water, electricity, and basic kind of foodstuffs and clothing needs met. Right? Nothing luxurious, but there's just sort of a floor under which you are not going to fall. And this is for everybody in your society. Those kinds of identity-based claims for access to resources are just going to be, I think, naturally fewer, because people are going to find sort of solidarity along issues that are not only about scrambling for resources. Now, I mean, maybe that's a idealistic, optimistic point of view. You know I can hear in my mind critics saying, "Oh, people are always going to be, hating each other." I actually don't think that's necessarily true.
I don't think
and this
so
comes
either.
back to something that I said earlier, right? Which is that the ethnographic evidence shows that in these societies that were poor, they were poorer than the West, but they had this basic economic and social stability provided by the state, that the sociality among people, right, that the relationships between family members and colleagues and friends and intimate partners were much more harmonious, because people weren't necessarily scrambling It wasn't a dog eat dog, zero sum world. If anything, people, because there was scarcity in the economy, people actually helped each other by standing in lines for each other or by getting extra of something, and then bartering with each other to share. There were mechanisms of dealing with the scarcity that was provided, that was caused really by the planned economy that created social networks and bonds. Now, that doesn't, again, I don't want to undermine the real problems of, let's say, the secret police, the Stasi, and the ways in which those kinds of acquaintance level relationships that we have in the United States were much more difficult because you couldn't trust people that you didn't know really well. But the people that you knew well enough, people in your circle, those relationships were really, really important to people because they were completely decommodified in a really interesting way. Unlike today, where you have, I know, Harriet, you've talked about the seekingarrangement.com website. You have websites like rentafriend.com where you can pay for somebody to go to a baseball game or a museum with you. There are all these apps that are commodifying our relationships and our
girlfriend
friendships.
experience.
The girlfriend experience. Thank you. Exactly. Right. All of that. I mean, that's just like crazy idea. I have just a funny memory to share. Back in the early 90s, my ex-husband was Bulgarian and we were in Berkeley in graduate school and we were at a used bookstore. And I picked up an English Progress Publishers volume, one of the volumes of the collected works of Lenin. I don't even remember what it was. And I was about, it was a used book and it had been somebody's book in Berkeley and I thought it was kind of cool. So I was buying it. And my, who was my boyfriend at the time, he said, "You can't play hard currency for Lenin." Right? Like Lenin is something you get for free. Like that's just something that the state provides. And I kind of feel like that's the same idea of like, you can't pay hard currency for friendship. That's just something that doesn't belong in the market, right? If you grew up in that society, there are just certain things that you don't buy. And friendship and companionship are things that really just should not be in the market. Now, that's not a criticism of people who, for one reason or the other, need to sell these things in the market because we live in a brutal capitalist society that makes it very difficult for people to survive otherwise, or for people who make an agentic choice to do so. But I do think that we need to be much more critical, as Harriet says, for our own kind of mental health. I mean, think about the way that we talk about, in my own language, we say that we spend time with people. Why don't we say that we share time with people, right? We say that we invest in relationships, or when we break up with a significant other, we say that we're going back out on the market. Think of the language that we use around relationships. We should say that we nurture our relationships, not invest in them.
Yes. So I guess so in that same vein, because I've been down a rabbit hole of research on the Cold War recently. I mean, your book is one of a few sources there. And trying to understand like this question sometimes when people say like, well, communism always fails and these experiments they tried, like they gave the college try for a few decades and they just killed a bunch of people and it didn't work. But there like often isn't really a serious conversation about like, so how much was it like internal contradictions because like the systems just weren't built well, and how much was like the global capitalist system that had already been put in place through centuries of like, from the feudal system to colonialism to imperialism to like the massive imperial, like militaristic and CIA kind of forces of like the US and the West, like also putting pressure through like dozens of proxy wars. Like, okay, communism spreading over there. Let's go fund a right-wing militia to kill everybody that's like kind of making successes. Right. So, and like, again, which isn't to say like, even if you have the most best faith, like good, like a sort of steel manning, they say is the opposite of like a straw man argument. If you say like, well, let's say that there were like the Marxist Leninism, like violent coup, let's take over the state approach. Let's actually say that was like a pretty bad idea. And maybe that was not the best way to do it or whatever. Even if like there was some good stuff coming intentionally from like the CIA and all that. it's like they actually did spend like trillions of dollars over
Yes.
several decades, right, to like not only engage in proxy wars, which used, psychological operations, covert ops, black ops, murder, torture, lying, deception, like insane things. But they were also trying to kind of like get in and like meddle within the USSR and the Soviet bloc like countries to like find dissidents, find exiles, find whoever, give them a mic, put them on the radio, get the radio into the USSR, like try to sort of, it's actually not too dissimilar to what Russia today has allegedly been doing to the US,
It's
right?
just massive
it's actually the same
disinformation.
thing.
Yep.
Right. And it's so, to me, it's also really hard to parse these things out because like, it's we live within the so-called imperial core where like all of that originated, and we've only been heard the stories from within the imperial core that has been still trying to justify all that it did. And so like how do you parse out like all the things that did lead to the so-called like collapse or the the sort of balkanized like aftermath of all these different areas, like which were factors that were sort of just internal problems that like they just couldn't stand on their own, and which were like the West actually doing what even Stalin became like hyper paranoid about, but like that they were actually doing those things, right, to like try to sabotage them and like destroy, whether it was like agriculture or like poisoning or I don't know, brainwashing people. It's like so hard for me to even
Right.
like how the hell can we actually know? It's really hard.
I actually wrote an article about Radio Free Liberty and Radio Free Europe
Oh wow.
in the Baffler. I think it was 2 years ago. I can't remember what it's called, but you, if you find it sort of deals very much with this question of American propaganda, and exactly, there's, and then the other book that I would highly recommend that you read is Derek Lambert's The 50-Year Wound.
Okay.
Which is about how much money we spent, the United States, fighting the Cold War.
Right. The last number I saw was 8 trillion, but I don't know if that's... Yeah.
Because here's the thing, Max, that I think is so interesting, and I talk about this in my classes. A lot of people want to say that communism was just a weak system and that we didn't have to actually do anything, that it would just fall on its own, right? And so there's this argument that like, okay, well, communism will never work because it's got all these internal systemic contradictions and it just sort of falls apart. Well, you can't have it both ways. If it was just going to fall apart, why did we spend $8 trillion fighting it?
Right.
That's just a waste of money then, right?
Right. Just let it collapse. Right.
Either it was a real threat or it wasn't a real threat. You can't really have it both ways. And I think that that's the thing that's really interesting when we think about what was going on in the Cold War is that, look, from the perspective of influence on the global South, and Chile with Salvador Allende is a really interesting case. Like he was democratically elected. There was no coup there. The coup was in the other direction. Right? We installed Pinochet. So, the politics of this are really, really interesting. And I get into all sorts of trouble because people call me an apologist for Stalin and I'm trying to defend, the gulags and the famines or whatever. And that's really, that just seems to me a perpetuation of this very anti-communist Cold War discourse, because a lot of people who were involved in those covert operations, some of them are still alive. And I think that a lot of them are, although that generation is passing, and I think that a lot of those people, I don't want to impugn them. I think that they really believed that communism was an evil system and that they were willing to spill blood in order to defend what they thought was freedom and democracy. But so if anybody comes along and starts saying things like, well, actually, it wasn't that bad, right? There were some good things that really questions their, what they did. Right. And I think that's one of the reasons why it's so hard to have a conversation about this.
God, yeah. Thank you so much, Kristen. This is such an exciting and important conversation. So thanks for coming on.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Just a big thank you to our patrons, First Winter and Sarah Turner. And thank you, as always, Liam, for help with the editing and the social media. If anybody has any kind of questions, thoughts, reactions, like feedback you want to give about this episode, just email us at itsnotjustinyourhead@gmail.com. If you want to become a supporter to support our program and help give Liam some some dollars for his editing because it's a lot of work. I used to do it myself. Go to patreon.com/itsnotjustinyourhead. By the way, listeners, if you have enjoyed anything you've heard Harriet say in this program, you will definitely enjoy Capitalism Hits Home, which is a solo program that Harriet does through Democracy at Work, which is a worker-owned cooperative that produces other great programs such as Economic Update with Richard Wolff and the Anti-Capitalist Chronicles with David Harvey. I can't recommend enough that everyone also listen to Capitalism Hits Home if you enjoy It's Not Just in Your Head.
Capitalism Hits Home is a sort of broader overhead view. It explores the way that capitalism shapes our personal lives, our psyches, our relationships, our families, and it looks particularly at the sea change in American personal life as all Americans, but the top 10 or 20% of Americans, have our security and our chance for a future become as precarious as it always was for minorities and families headed by women. It's not just in your head, and Capitalism Hits Home are definitely complementary.
And if listeners would like to check out Capitalism Hits Home, Harriet, where should they go to find it?
Either on YouTube or Democracy at Work or on my own website, harrietfraud.com.